Today I want to walk through one of the strongest Jewish objections to Jesus being the Messiah. And I mean that, one of the strongest. This is not a weak argument. This is not something you can wave away. It comes directly from the Hebrew Bible. It uses the text correctly. And if you haven't heard a good answer to it, it can genuinely shake you. The objection comes from Jeremiah 33, verses 17 and 18. And to understand it, we need to read the whole passage it comes from, starting at verse 14. God says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days Judah shall be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell securely. And this is the name by which it will be called, the Lord is our righteousness. For thus says the Lord, David shall never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel, and the Levitical priests shall never lack a man in my presence to offer burnt offerings, to burn grain offerings, and to make sacrifices forever." Now here is the objection. Verses 17 and 18 are not a separate standalone promise. They are directly connected to the arrival of the branch, the Messianic figure described right before them. The phrase, "for thus says the Lord," in verse 17, is a grammatical connector. It ties what comes next to what just came before. These aren't two unrelated ideas sitting next to each other. They are one unified picture. When the Messiah comes, two things happen alongside his arrival. A Davidic king reigns on the throne, and the Levitical priests offer sacrifices forever. Neither of those things has happened. There has been no Davidic king on a throne since 586 BC, when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. Levitical sacrifice ended in 70 AD, when Rome destroyed the temple. And so the objection is this: by the Hebrew Bible's own terms, on its own conditions, Jesus cannot be the branch. He cannot be the Messiah, because the things that were supposed to accompany the Messiah's arrival never happened. That is the argument. And I want to be honest with you about how serious it is before I answer it, because the only way to have a real conversation is to actually respect what the other side is saying. So, let's start with what the objection gets right, because it gets several things right. It is correct that verses 17 and 18 are linked to the branch. The grammar demands it. The "for" in verse 17 is a connector, not the start of a new idea. These promises are tied to the Messianic arrival. It is correct that a plain reading of verses 17 and 18 describes a Davidic king on a throne and Levitical priests offering specific sacrifices, burnt offerings, grain offerings, forever. That is what the text says. And it is correct that neither of those things has happened in any historically observable literal sense since the 1st century. That is simply true. Any answer that tries to sidestep those 3 points is not actually an answer. So I'm not going to sidestep them. I'm going to grant all 3 and then show you why the objection is still not decisive, because there is a question it has to answer that it hasn't answered. That question is this: what kind of figure is the branch? Because the entire force of the objection depends on the assumption that the branch is a human Davidic king, a great ruler, a powerful man from David's line, but still a man. And if that's what the branch is, then yes, you would reasonably expect him to reign on a literal throne, and you would reasonably expect the institutions around him to continue in recognizable form. The absence of both would be genuinely damaging to any messianic claim. But here is the problem. The Hebrew Bible does not describe the branch as merely a human Davidic king. And this is not a Christian interpretation being read into the text from the outside. This is what Jeremiah himself says. Go back to Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6. This is the parallel branch passage. Same prophet, same book. Earlier in that book, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely, and this is the name by which he will be called, Yahweh our righteousness." Jeremiah names the branch Yahweh, not Adonai, not Elohim, not El Shaddai. Yahweh, the exclusive, personal name of the God of Israel. The name so sacred in Second Temple Judaism it wasn't even spoken aloud. The name God gives himself at the burning bush. The name that distinguishes the God of Israel from every other god in the ancient world. That is the name Jeremiah gives to the branch. Now, I know what the counter-argument is, and I want to address it directly because it's the most serious challenge to everything I just said. The counter is that Yahweh our righteousness is a throne name, a royal honorific. Ancient Near Eastern kings sometimes bore names that invoked their deity, and this doesn't necessarily mean the branch literally is Yahweh. The comparison to the name Emmanuel sometimes comes up. That name doesn't have to mean the child bearing it is literally God. That's a real argument. So let me give it a real answer. Yahweh is not a generic divine title. El, Adonai, Elohim, those are titles, and yes, they were used in the names of kings and people throughout the ancient world. But Yahweh is different in kind. It is the exclusive personal name of the God of Israel. And here is the fact that the throne name reading cannot get around. Nowhere in the entire Hebrew Bible is Yahweh used as a throne name or honorific bestowed on a human king. Not once. There is no parallel. When ancient kings received throne names, those names used generic divine titles or epithets, never the exclusive personal name of their God. If Jeremiah had wanted to give the branch an impressive royal title invoking God, he had plenty of options. He used none of them. He used Yahweh. And the absence of any other example of that usage in the entire Hebrew scriptures is not a minor footnote. It is the point. The most linguistically consistent reading of what Jeremiah wrote is that he is making a claim about the branch's identity that exceeds ordinary kingship. The branch is not just a great human ruler from David's line. The branch is Yahweh entering human history through that line. Now sit with that for a moment, because this isn't a small move. If that identification is correct, if Jeremiah is genuinely naming the branch with the personal name of God, then everything changes about what the branch's arrival is supposed to look like. And that is exactly where the objection stops working. Because once you take that seriously, on the text's own terms, the objection's assumption collapses. Because the objection asks, why didn't the Levitical priesthood continue? Why wasn't there a Davidic king on a literal throne after Jesus arrived? And the assumption buried in that question is that the branch's arrival should look like the arrival of a powerful human king who renovates and perpetuates existing institutions. But if the branch is Yahweh himself, the question changes entirely. The Levitical priesthood existed for one reason: to mediate between a holy God and an unclean people. Every sacrifice, every burnt offering, every grain offering was an enacted acknowledgement that sin requires atonement and that something has to die in the place of the guilty. The entire sacrificial system was built around a single question: how does a holy God dwell among sinful people? If the branch is Yahweh himself entering humanity to answer that question definitively and permanently, then what would it even mean for the sacrificial system to continue unchanged alongside that? The shadow does not keep running after the reality has arrived. The system was pointing towards someone. When that someone comes, the pointing stops, not because the promise failed, but because it landed. And this isn't a Christian invention. The Hebrew Bible signals it from within itself. Psalm 110 verse 4. God speaks to the Messianic figure and says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Now I want to make sure this lands because it's easy to read past it. Melchizedek appears in Genesis 14. That's before Aaron, before Moses, before the covenant at Sinai, before the Levitical system exists at all. He is a priest king. He holds both offices simultaneously, and he blesses Abraham. He shows up, blesses Abraham, and largely disappears from the narrative. He has no genealogy listed, no priestly lineage, no institutional succession. He simply is who he is, and his priesthood derives from that. Now, centuries later, after the Levitical system is fully established and functioning, after Aaron, after all of it, a Davidic psalm is written. And in that psalm, God makes an oath, not about the Levitical priesthood continuing, about a completely different priestly order, the order of Melchizedek. Think about why that matters. If the Levitical priesthood were the final word on how God relates to humanity, there would be no reason, none, for a psalm written inside the Levitical era to introduce a different priestly order for the coming Messiah. Why bring up Melchizedek at all, unless the Levitical system was always understood to be provisional, always understood to be pointing towards something it could not itself be? Psalm 110 is the Hebrew Bible planting a flag inside its own text. The Messiah's priesthood is grounded in a divine oath, not biological succession. It operates on a different basis entirely. And that means the end of Levitical sacrifice is not a crisis for Messianic fulfillment. It is the expected outcome once the one the sacrifices were pointing toward has arrived. There's one more piece of Jeremiah 33 that matters here. Verses 20 and 21. Thus says the Lord, if you can break my covenant with the day and my covenant with the night, so that day and night will not come at their appointed time, then also my covenant with David my servant may be broken, so that he shall not have a son to reign on his throne. God grounds the certainty of the Davidic promise in the fixed order of creation itself. Day and night. That's the analogy. This is not the language of institutional succession that depends on unbroken human continuity. This is the language of eschatological guarantee. The Davidic line will produce the promised ruler with the same certainty that tomorrow will come, regardless of any interruption. The Babylonian exile interrupted the literal succession. The destruction of the temple ended Levitical sacrifice. Neither event broke the covenant, because the covenant was never dependent on uninterrupted human institutions. It was dependent on the faithfulness of the God who orders the cosmos. The interruptions are not evidence of failure. They are precisely the kind of catastrophe the promise was made to address. So here is the full answer. The objection is strong, and it has been treated as such. It correctly reads verses 17 and 18 as tied to the branch. It correctly observes that a plain reading describes Davidic kingship and Levitical sacrifice accompanying the Messiah's arrival. It correctly notes that neither happened literally after the 1st century. All of that is granted. What it does not establish is what kind of fulfillment to expect, because it assumes the branch is a human king without engaging what Jeremiah himself says about the branch's identity. When Jeremiah names the branch Yahweh using the exclusive personal name of God, with no parallel as a human honorific anywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, the nature of fulfillment changes fundamentally. The Levitical system was pointing toward the one who would finally and permanently answer the question it was always asking. Psalm 110 confirms from within the Hebrew Bible that the Messiah's priesthood supersedes rather than perpetuates the Levitical order. And the covenant's certainty is grounded in God's faithfulness, not the unbroken continuity of human institutions. The objection assumes a human branch, and then faults Jesus for not fulfilling a human branch's role. But Jeremiah's own description of the branch exceeds that category. Once that is taken seriously on the text's own terms, what fulfillment looks like changes with it. And the absence of Levitical sacrifice is no longer evidence against Jesus. It becomes consistent with the arrival of the one the sacrifices were always anticipating. Anyways, that's it for this video. I hope this brought an explanation to this objection for anyone who has been looking for one. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.